Before the nurse could adjust the morphine drip, before she could smooth the blanket or check the monitors that blinked softly in the dim light, a frail hand caught her wrist with surprising strength. "You have the same eyes." The voice was thin, threaded with exhaustion, but the words were clear. "The same eyes my sister had the night she left a man who was killing her slowly." Seren Vesper's hand froze. Her breath stopped somewhere between her lungs and her throat. The dying woman's next words were quieter, almost tender. "How long have you been running, child?" In the doorway, a man who had built empires on fear and silence stood completely still. Because Cale Morrigan had come to say goodbye to his mother. He had not expected to find her holding the wrist of a woman who looked like she had nowhere left to run, and asking the one question no one else had ever thought to ask. The Morrigan estate sat at the edge of Veldon Ridge, a coastal town that had once been prosperous, and was now something quieter, something hollowed out by time. The house itself was 3 stories of gray stone and dark windows, surrounded by oak trees that had long since stopped reaching toward the sun, and instead grew sideways, bent by decades of salt wind from the sea. Inside, the rooms were immaculate but unused, furniture draped in cloths, fireplaces that hadn't been lit in years, hallways where footsteps echoed longer than they should have. The only room that felt alive was on the second floor, east wing. A bedroom with heavy curtains pulled back to let in what little October light remained. Medical equipment hummed beside an antique bed. Flowers sat on the nightstand, fresh ones, changed daily, because Seren had noticed on her first day that the dying woman turned her head toward them every morning. It was the kind of house that had witnessed things. The kind that kept secrets in its walls and let them out only in the creaking of floorboards late at night. It was the kind of house where a woman could disappear. And that was exactly why Seren Vesper had taken the job. Seren was 31 years old. She had auburn hair that she tied back every morning in a low braid, the same way her mother had taught her when she was 9. Her hands were steady. They had to be. But there was a tremor in her left one that only appeared late at night, when she was alone, when there was no one to perform calmness for. She had been at the Morrigan estate for 23 days. Before that, she had worked at a hospice in Carroll County, 40 miles south. Before that, a hospital in Dunmore. Before that, a clinic in a town whose name she had trained herself to forget, because forgetting was safer than remembering. 3 jobs in 14 months. 3 cities. 3 times she had packed a single suitcase in the middle of the night and driven until the sun came up. The pattern was always the same: arrive, work, keep her head down, and tell no one anything real. And then, a phone call. A figure in a parking lot. A feeling in her chest like ice water. And she would run again. She had $340 in an envelope tucked inside her suitcase. She had a phone with no contact saved. She had a nursing license under a name that was legally hers, but felt like a costume she wore. And she had this job, cash payment, no paperwork, no background check, caring for a dying woman in a house full of silence. The agency had called it a private placement for a client who values discretion. What they hadn't told her was that the client was Edine Morrigan. What they hadn't told her was that Edine's son was Cale Morrigan, a name Seren had never heard, but one that made the agency coordinator pause on the phone, clear her throat, and say, "You'll be well compensated. Just do the work. Don't ask questions." Seren didn't ask questions. Questions were luxuries for people who had somewhere to go if the answers turned dangerous. So she changed the IV bags and checked the vitals and adjusted the pillows. She read aloud from the books stacked on the nightstand. Poetry mostly, collections with cracked spines and pages soft from years of handling. She learned that Edine liked her tea with honey, not sugar. That she slept better with the window cracked open, even in the cold. That she had a habit of reaching out in her sleep, her fingers searching for a hand that wasn't there. And Seren held that hand. Every night. not because it was in her job description, but because she understood what it meant to reach for something in the dark and find nothing. Edine Morrigan was 74 years old. She had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 8 months ago. The doctors had given her 6 months. She had outlasted their predictions with the quiet stubbornness of a woman who had spent her whole life outlasting things. She rarely spoke during the first 2 weeks. When she did, it was in fragments. Names Seren didn't recognize. Places that seemed to belong to another era. But on the 23rd day, something shifted. Edine's eyes cleared. Her voice, when it came, was no longer wandering. She looked at Seren with an expression that was too knowing, too precise, and too alive for a woman who had been drifting in and out of consciousness for days. And she asked the question that stopped Seren's heart. "How long have you been running, child?" Seren did not answer the question. She couldn't. The words lodged somewhere behind her ribs, sharp and immovable. But her mind answered. Her mind went back to the night that had started all of this. The night she had stopped being Seren Mallory and started being Seren Vesper. 14 months ago. A house in Brennick Falls with blue shutters and a garden she had planted herself. A husband named Auric, who had loved her once, or had performed love so convincingly that she hadn't known the difference until it was too late. Auric Mallory was a detective. He had a badge, a reputation, colleagues who respected him, neighbors who waved at him on Sunday mornings when he mowed the lawn. He coached a youth basketball league. He donated to the fire department. He was, by every external measure, a good man, and he had spent 3 years dismantling Seren from the inside out. It had started small, a comment about her clothes, a suggestion that she didn't need to see her friends so often. A hand on her arm that squeezed just a little too hard, then released with an apology and a smile. She had learned to read the weather of his moods the way sailors read the sky, watching for the signs that a storm was coming, adjusting her behavior to keep the air calm. But storms don't stay calm forever, and Oryx had grown worse with each passing month. The night everything cracked was not the worst night. That was the thing Seren could never explain to anyone. It wasn't the night he broke her wrist. She had stayed after that, told the ER nurse she had fallen down the stairs. It wasn't the night he locked her in the basement for 6 hours. She had stayed after that too, because he had cried afterward, because he had promised, because she had nowhere else to go. The night everything cracked was the night she found the folder. It was in his office, tucked inside a drawer she had never opened, a folder with her name on it. Inside were photographs of her at work, at the grocery store, at the coffee shop she visited on Tuesday afternoons, logs of her phone calls, printouts of her text messages, notes in Oryx's handwriting, times she left the house, times she returned, names of people she spoke to, descriptions of what she wore. He had been surveilling her, not occasionally, constantly, for months. And at the bottom of the folder, a single page with a list of names, women's names, 7 of them, each one crossed out with a red line. Seren didn't know who those women were. She didn't know what the red lines meant. But something inside her understood in the way the body understands danger before the mind catches up. She had packed one bag. She had taken $400 from the emergency cash hidden in the kitchen. She had left her phone on the nightstand because she knew that he could track it. And she had driven through the night with her hands shaking on the wheel and her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her chest open. She had gone to the police in the next town. She had shown them the folder. And the officer behind the desk had looked at her with something between pity and doubt and said, "Ma'am, your husband is a decorated detective. Are you sure you're not misunderstanding something?" That was when Seren learned the first rule of running from a man like Auric. No one believes you. The second rule came 3 days later when she found him waiting outside the motel where she was hiding. He hadn't touched her. He had simply leaned against her car and smiled and said, You know I'll always find you, Seren. That's what I do. I find people. She had been running ever since. Adine's hand was still wrapped around Seren's wrist. The grip was weak. The grip of a woman whose body was failing her, but the eyes were sharp, clear, undeceived. You don't have to tell me, Edine said softly. I already know. I've seen that look before. I wore it myself for 11 years. Seren's breath caught. Mrs. Morrigan. Edine, please, I'm dying. I don't have time for formality. A thin smile crossed her lips, then faded. My sister, Brienne. She married a man who everyone adored, charming, successful, respected. And behind closed doors, he was killing her. Not with his fists, although there was that too, but with control, with isolation, with the slow, patient work of making her believe she was nothing without him. Seren couldn't speak. Her throat had closed. I watched her disappear, Adine continued. Year by year, the woman I had grown up with, the one who laughed too loud and danced in the kitchen and told me I was brave even when I wasn't, she vanished. And in her place was someone who flinched at shadows, someone who apologized for breathing, someone who had forgotten she had ever been anything other than afraid. The monitors beeped softly. Outside, the October wind pressed against the window. I begged her to leave. For 8 years, I begged her. I told her she could stay with me, that we would figure it out together, that she was allowed to want more than survival. Edine paused, her voice thinning. And one night, she finally believed me. She packed a bag. She was going to come to my house the next morning. She called me at 11 o'clock and said, Edine, the hardest part wasn't deciding to leave. The hardest part was believing I was allowed to. Seren shook her head slowly, already sensing where this was going. She never made it to morning, Edine whispered. They found her at the bottom of the stairs. They called it an accident. I called it murder. But no one listened to me, just like no one had listened to her. The words hit Seren like a wave she hadn't seen coming. Her eyes burned, her chest ached. And for a moment, just a moment, the mask she had been wearing for 14 months slipped. Edine saw it. Of course she saw it. How long? She asked again, gentler this time. 14 months, Seren whispered. I've been running for 14 months. And how long were you trapped before that? The question opened something in Seren's chest that she had walled off so completely she had forgotten it was there. She pressed her free hand to her mouth. She tried to breathe. She tried to hold herself together the way she always did, with discipline, with distance, with the practiced calm of a woman who had learned that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford. But Adine's eyes held her, and in them, Seren saw something she hadn't seen in 14 months. Recognition, not pity, not judgment. Recognition. 3 years, Seren said, and her voice broke on the second word. I was trapped for 3 years. Edine nodded slowly. Her thumb moved across Serene's wrist in a gesture so small, so tender, that it nearly undid her completely. Then you've been surviving for a lifetime's worth of fear in just over 4 years, Edine said. And you're still standing. You're still working. You're still gentle with a dying woman you don't know. She paused. That's not weakness, child. That's the kind of strength most people will never understand. In the doorway, Cale Morrigan had not moved. He had heard everything. And somewhere behind the wall he had built around himself. The wall that had kept him alive in a world where softness was a liability. Something cracked. Not broken. Cracked. Because broken meant you couldn't move. And Cale was already moving toward a decision he didn't yet understand. Cale Morrigan was 43 years old. He had dark hair threaded with early gray at the temples, and eyes the color of slate after rain, pale, unreadable, trained from childhood to give nothing away. He ran an organization that operated across 4 states. He employed over 300 people, most of whom had never seen his face. He had lawyers who made problems disappear, accountants who made money untraceable, and a reputation that preceded him the way winter precedes frost. By the time you felt it, something had already changed. But Cale had not always been this. Once he had been a boy of 9, sitting in a kitchen in Briarvale, watching his Aunt Brienne press a bag of frozen peas against her cheekbone, while his mother held her hand and wept. "You have to leave him," his mother had said. "Brienne, please. He'll kill you." "I can't." Brienne's voice had been so small, so flattened. "He'll find me. He always finds me. You don't understand, Idine. Men like Gage, they don't let go. They just tighten." Cale had stood in the doorway, unseen, unnoticed. He had watched his aunt, the woman who used to sneak him chocolate when his mother wasn't looking, the woman who had taught him to play piano, the woman who had once told him that the secret to life was being brave even when you didn't feel brave, and he had not recognized her. The woman in that kitchen was a ghost wearing his aunt's face, and the man who had made her that way, Gage Whitford, businessman, philanthropist, beloved figure in their community, was sitting in his living room 2 miles away, untouched and untouchable. Cale's mother had begged. She had offered money, a place to stay, lawyers, anything. But Brienne had just shaken her head again and again, her eyes fixed on some middle distance where hope had long since stopped existing. "He has people everywhere," she had whispered. "Police, judges, friends who owe him favors. If I run, he'll destroy me. And if I stay, he'll kill me." There's no door out of this room, Idine. There never was. 3 weeks later, Brienne Whitford was found at the bottom of a staircase in her own home. The official report called it an accident. A tragic fall. A grieving husband who couldn't stop crying at the funeral. Cale was 9 years old. He had watched Gage Whitford shake hands with mourners, accept condolences, dab at his eyes with a handkerchief. And something inside that boy had calcified into something harder than bone. He had made a promise to himself that day. Not out loud, he was too young for words that big, but in the place where promises live when they're too important to speak. He had promised that he would never be powerless again. He had promised that he would become the kind of man who could open doors that others couldn't. And he had promised that if he ever saw another woman wearing that haunted, hollowed look his aunt had worn, the look of someone who had been told there was no way out, he would burn down whatever walls were keeping her trapped. He had kept that promise, again and again, in ways the world would never know about. Women who came to him through whispered networks, through coded requests, through friends of friends who knew that Cale Morrigan had resources and a particular hatred for men who used their power to destroy the people who trusted them. He never took money for it. He never took credit. He simply made things happen. A new identity, a safe passage, a problem that suddenly, inexplicably, stopped being a problem. Gage Whitford had died in a car accident 6 years after Brienne's funeral. Single vehicle collision. Icy road. No witnesses. The police had ruled it an accident. Cale had attended the funeral. He had not cried. Now he stood in the doorway of his mother's room, watching a woman he didn't know confess to a trauma that he recognized down to its molecular structure. He watched her fight to hold herself together. He watched her fail. He watched his mother, dying, fading, running out of hours, offer this stranger the one thing that mattered, the gift of being truly seen. And something shifted in Cale Morrigan, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. He stepped back from the doorway silently. He pulled out his phone. He sent a single message to a man named Thorne, who had worked with him for 15 years and knew better than to ask unnecessary questions. "I need everything on a man named Oric Mallory. Detective, Brennick Falls. Full workup. Quiet." Then he put the phone away and stood in the hallway with his back against the wall, staring at nothing, listening to his mother's voice murmur something soft through the half-open door. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know her story beyond the fragments he had just overheard. He didn't know if she was telling the truth. But he knew the look on her face. He had seen it on his aunt's face 34 years ago, and he had promised himself, promised the 9-year-old boy who had stood helpless in a kitchen doorway, that he would never look away. He wasn't about to start now. Seren didn't see Kale until the next morning. She had spent the night in the small room adjacent to Edine's, a servant's quarters from another era, converted now into a space for the live-in nurse. The bed was narrow but clean. The walls were bare except for a single window that looked out onto the oak trees. She had slept poorly, as she always did, waking every few hours to listen for sounds that didn't belong. At 6:15, she braided her hair in the mirror. The same braid. The same motion. The ritual that told her she was still herself, even when everything else was uncertain. At 6:30, she checked on Adine, who was sleeping deeply, her breathing shallow but steady. At 6:45, she walked downstairs to the kitchen to prepare tea and found Cale Morrigan sitting at the long wooden table, a cup of coffee already in front of him, his eyes fixed on her the moment she entered. Seren stopped in the doorway. She had seen him before, of course. Glimpses. A figure in the hallway. A voice speaking quietly on the phone in another room. The agency had told her the family valued privacy, and she had respected that boundary the way she respected all boundaries. Absolutely, because boundaries were the architecture of survival. But she had never been alone with him. And now, standing in the gray morning light of a kitchen that smelled like coffee and silence, she understood why the agency coordinator had paused on the phone. Cale Morrigan was not a man who blended into rooms. He was the kind of man rooms rearranged themselves around. "Sit down," he said. Not unkindly, but not gently either. A statement of fact. "Please." The please came late, like an afterthought. Like he had remembered halfway through the sentence that other people used that word. Seren didn't sit. She stayed near the doorway, her weight balanced, her eyes scanning the exits. Old habits. The habits that had kept her alive. "I'm not going to hurt you," Cale said. He hadn't moved. His hands remained flat on the table, visible, deliberate. "I need you to know that? You don't know me well enough to make that promise." "You're right. I don't." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "But I know what I heard last night. And I know that a woman who has been running for 14 months doesn't scare easily. So the fact that you're standing near that door, calculating how many steps it would take to reach it, that tells me more than you realize." Seren's jaw tightened. "You were listening." "I was standing in the doorway." Listening implies effort. I simply didn't leave. "That's not better." "No," he agreed. "It's not. But it's honest. And I suspect you've had enough dishonesty to last several lifetimes." The words landed somewhere in her chest. She didn't respond. Cale picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and set it down again. "My mother likes you. She told me this morning. Said you're the first nurse who doesn't treat her like she's already dead." A pause. "She also told me to stay away from you. Said you'd been through enough without having to deal with a man like me." "A man like you?" Her words. I think she meant it as a warning. Should I take it as one? Cale's eyes met hers. Slate gray. Unreadable. But somewhere beneath the surface something flickered. Something that wasn't cold, wasn't calculating, wasn't the mask he wore for the rest of the world. "My mother has good instincts," he said quietly. "She always has. If she says you should be careful around me, she's probably right." He stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor. "But she also asked me to do something, and I don't refuse her requests. Not anymore." Not with the time she has left. What did she ask? Kale walked to the counter, poured a second cup of coffee, and set it on the table in front of the empty chair across from him. She asked me to make sure you're safe, he said. Genuinely safe. Not the kind of safe that comes from running, the kind that comes from knowing you don't have to run anymore. Seren stared at the coffee cup. Steam curled upward, thin and pale. I don't know you, she said. No, you don't. I don't trust you. You shouldn't. Trust is earned. I haven't earned anything. He sat back down. But I'm asking you to let me try. Not for my sake. For hers. She's dying, and she's decided that before she goes, she wants to know that you're protected. I don't know why she's chosen you. She didn't explain. But my mother doesn't make requests like this lightly. Seren's hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her sides. And if I say no, then I'll respect that. You'll finish your work here. You'll be paid what you're owed. And when my mother passes, you'll leave. And I'll never contact you again. His voice was steady. But you'll still be running. And the man you're running from will still be looking. And one day, maybe not soon, but eventually, he'll find you. The silence that followed was heavy. It pressed against the walls. How do you know he's still looking? Seren whispered. Kale's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. Something dark. Something that had seen the underside of the world and knew exactly what lived there. Because men like him don't stop, he said. I know the type. I've dealt with the type. And I know what it takes to make them stop. He let the words settle. Sit down, Seren. Please. Let me tell you what I found. Seren sat. She didn't know why. Every instinct she had, every lesson the last 14 months had taught her, screamed that she should leave. Walk out. Take her suitcase and her $340 and disappear into another city, another name, another temporary life. But she was tired. God, she was so tired. And there was something in Kale Morgan's voice that her instincts couldn't categorize. Not safe, exactly, but not predatory either. Something else. Something that sounded almost like recognition. Kale slid a folder across the table. It was thin, maybe a dozen pages, but Seren's stomach dropped the moment she saw it. Oric Mallory, Kale said, 38 years old. Detective, Brennick Falls Police Department. Decorated officer. Commendations for community service, investigative excellence, mentorship of junior officers. He paused. Married once, to a woman named Seren Mallory, née Valdris. Marriage ended 14 months ago when she disappeared in the middle of the night. Seren couldn't breathe. He filed a missing persons report, Kale continued. Told his colleagues he was worried about your mental state. Said you'd been struggling with anxiety, depression. Said he was afraid you might hurt yourself. His voice was flat, clinical. The report generated a regional alert. Your name, your real name, is still flagged in 3 state databases. That's not... Seren's voice cracked. He's lying. I'm not... I know. Kale's tone softened, just slightly. I know he's lying. The profile doesn't match. Women who are genuinely mentally unwell don't successfully disappear for 14 months, change their identities, maintain employment, and send no communications to anyone from their past. That's not instability. That's discipline. That's survival. He turned a page in the folder. But that's not what concerned me. This is. He slid a photograph across the table. Seren looked at it and felt the room tilt. It was a picture of her. Recent. Taken from a distance. She was walking out of a pharmacy in Caro County, the town where she'd worked before coming here. The timestamp was 6 weeks ago. He's tracking you, Kale said. He has been for months. I don't know how yet, but I have people working on it. My guess is he's using law enforcement databases. Maybe some off-the-books contacts. Men like him always have contacts. Seren's hands were shaking. She pressed them against the table to steady them. There's more, Cale said. He pulled out another page. The folder you found in his office. The one with the 7 names. I had my people look into it. You. How do you know about that? My mother told me. She said you mentioned it to her yesterday after I left. She tells me things she thinks I need to know. He met her eyes. Do you want to know what we found? Seren didn't want to know. She had spent 14 months not knowing, and the not knowing had been a kind of protection. But she nodded. Teh. 6 of those 7 women are dead, Cale said quietly. Different cities, different years, accidents, suicides. One ruled undetermined. No connections between them except one. All of them, at some point, had been romantically involved with your husband. The room went completely silent. Seren heard her own heartbeat in her ears. She heard the wind outside. She heard, somewhere far away, the creak of the old house settling. The 7th woman, Cale continued, is alive. She lives in another state now, under a different name. She's been hiding for 9 years. My people reached out to her through secure channels. She confirmed what you already know. Auric Mallory is not just an abuser. He's something worse. And he doesn't let go. Seren's vision blurred. She blinked, and tears spilled down her cheeks. Not from sadness, but from something older. Something that had been buried so deep she had forgotten it existed. Validation. The unbearable, devastating relief of being believed. I'm telling you this, Cale said, because you need to understand the situation. And because you need to understand that when I say I can help you, I'm not speaking hypothetically. I have resources. I have people. And I have a very particular skill set when it comes to men who think they're untouchable. He closed the folder. My mother is dying. She has weeks, maybe less. She's spent her whole life carrying the guilt of not being able to save her sister. And yesterday, she looked at you and saw the same thing. A woman trapped by a man who has made the world believe he's a good person while destroying her behind closed doors. He paused. She asked me to help you. Not because she knows you. She doesn't. But because she knows herself. And she knows that if she dies without trying to change your story, Brienne's death will have meant nothing. Seren wiped her face with the back of her hand. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. Why do you care? Why does any of this matter to you? Cale was silent for a long moment. Then he said, because I made a promise once. To a boy who didn't understand why the world let men like your husband exist. Why people saw bruises and looked away. Why women died and everyone called it an accident. He looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, fully, without pretense. I promised him that if I ever had the power to change it, I would. And I have the power now. The only question is whether you'll let me use it. Seren stared at him across the table. She thought about the last 14 months. The running, the hiding, the scanning every room for exits, every parking lot for familiar cars, every quiet street at dusk for footsteps that didn't belong. She thought about the $340 in her suitcase, and the phone with no contacts, and the life she had built out of nothing but fear and momentum. And she thought about Idine upstairs, dying slowly in a room full of poetry books and fresh flowers, reaching out in her sleep for a hand that wasn't there. Okay, Seren whispered. The word was so small, but it changed everything. Okay, she said again, stronger. Tell me what to do. Cale moved quickly. Within 2 hours, 3 calls had been made. The first was to Thorne, who received instructions that were brief and specific. Full surveillance on Auric Mallory, all movements tracked, all communications monitored. The second was to a woman named Corinth Hale, a former federal prosecutor who now worked exclusively for clients who required discretion and results. She would handle the legal architecture, the documentation of abuse, the restraining orders, the quiet conversations with law enforcement officials who owed favors and knew better than to ask questions. The third call was to someone Cale referred to only as the specialist. Seren didn't ask what the specialist did. She wasn't sure she wanted to know, but she noticed the way Cale's voice changed during that call, harder, colder, and more precise. The voice of a man who had built his life on knowing which levers to pull and when. By noon, a car arrived at the estate. A woman stepped out, mid-50s, silver hair cut short, and dressed in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made for her. This was Corinth Hale. She carried a leather briefcase and walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never lost a case she intended to win. She met with Seren in the study on the first floor. For 2 hours, Seren talked. She told Corinth everything: the escalation, the isolation, the surveillance, the folder, the night she left. Corinth listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather notebook with a fountain pen. When Seren finished, Corinth looked up. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "I'm going to file an emergency protective order in a jurisdiction where your husband has no connections. Simultaneously, I'm going to have a conversation with the Brennick Falls Police Department about the irregularities in Detective Mallory's missing persons report. I have colleagues who specialize in these conversations. By the time they're finished, that report will be rescinded, and there will be questions, uncomfortable questions about why it was filed in the first place." "He'll know," Seren said. "He'll know someone is coming after him." "Yes, he will. And that's the point." Corinth closed her notebook. "Men like your husband operate in shadows. They rely on silence, on fear, on the assumption that no one is watching. The moment they realize someone is watching, someone with resources, someone who can't be intimidated, someone who knows exactly what they are, they lose their advantage. And if he comes for me anyway?" Corinth glanced toward the window, where Cale was visible in the garden, speaking on his phone. "Then he'll discover that you're no longer alone," she said simply, "and that the people standing beside you are not the kind who frighten easily." By evening, the first layer of protection was in place. Seren's name, her real name, her temporary names, all of them, had been flagged in systems that Oric Mallory didn't even know existed. If he searched for her, alerts would trigger. If he traveled toward the region, surveillance would follow. If he attempted contact, there would be a record. It wasn't freedom. Not yet. But it was something Seren hadn't felt in 14 months. It was the beginning of a door opening. That night, Seren sat with Idine. The morphine had been increased that afternoon. Idine drifted in and out of consciousness, her words fragmenting, her hands occasionally reaching for something only she could see. But there were moments of clarity, brief windows where her eyes focused and her voice steadied. During one of those windows, she looked at Seren and said, "Has he told you about Brienne?" Seren nodded. "Some of it." "Did he tell you he was there?" "The night she came to me with blood on her face. The night I begged her to leave and she told me there was no door out. He mentioned a kitchen. He was 9 years old." Idine's voice was thin but fierce. "He stood in the doorway and watched his aunt, the woman who taught him to play piano, who snuck him sweets, who loved him like her own, sit at my table with a shattered cheekbone and tell me she couldn't leave because her husband would find her, because no one would believe her, because the world was built for men like Gage Whitford, not for women like her." Seren held Idine's hand tighter. "He never forgave himself," Idine continued, "for being too young, for being too small, for not understanding until years later what he had witnessed." She closed her eyes. When she died, something in him calcified. He became someone who would never be powerless again. And he spent his life building the kind of power that could open doors for women who had been told there were no doors left. The organization he runs is many things, Idine said. Some of them I don't ask about, but some of them are exactly what Brienne needed and never had. Escape routes, safe passages, problems that stop being problems. She opened her eyes and looked at Seren. He's not a good man, by most definitions, but he's not a bad one either. He's something more complicated. Something forged in a kitchen 34 years ago, when a little boy learned that the world doesn't protect the people it should. Seren didn't respond. She didn't know how. I'm dying, Idine said quietly. I have days, maybe a week. And before I go, I need to know that I didn't make the same mistake twice. I couldn't save Brienne. I have carried that failure every day of my life. But you. She squeezed Serene's hand with what little strength remained. You, I can still help. Or rather, Kale can, if you let him. I already said yes, Seren whispered. This morning. I told him okay. Idine smiled, a faint, exhausted smile that held decades of sorrow and hope in equal measure. Good, she said. Then promise me something. Anything. When this is over, when you're safe, when the running stops, don't disappear. Don't vanish into another city and another name and another life of scanning every room for danger. Her eyes held Serene's. Let yourself be found. Not by him, by something better. By the life you were supposed to have before he stole it from you. Seren's eyes burned. I don't know how. Neither did Brienne, Idine said. But she told me once that she wished she'd had the chance to learn. A pause. You have that chance. Take it. Idine Morrigan died on a Tuesday morning, 3 days later. Seren was holding her hand when it happened. The monitors had slowed through the night, the breathing growing shallower, and the pauses between breaths stretching longer. At 6:47 in the morning, the pauses stopped stretching and simply became permanent. There was no drama, no final words, just a quiet release, like a door closing softly in a house that had finally grown still. Seren sat with her for a long time. She didn't call anyone. She didn't move. She just held Idine's hand, the same hand that had gripped her wrist that first day, that had seen through her with a single glance, that had offered her the first real kindness she had received in longer than she could remember. When she finally stood, her legs unsteady, she walked to the window and opened it the way Idine had liked. Just a crack. Just enough to let the October air slip through. The knock came 20 minutes later. Kale stood in the doorway. He looked at his mother's body, at the monitors that had been turned off, at Seren standing by the window with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. He didn't speak. He walked to the bed, sat on the edge, and took his mother's hand in both of his. Seren watched him bow his head. She watched his shoulders curve inward, the posture of a man trying to contain something too large for his body to hold. She watched him press his mother's hand against his forehead and stay there, motionless, for what felt like hours. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. It was the first time she had seen any crack in the surface he presented to the world. She told me, he said quietly, that her only regret was not getting more time with you. Seren's breath caught. With me? She said you reminded her of who Brienne was before, the version she remembered, the one who laughed too loud and told her she was brave. He set his mother's hand down gently, smoothing the blanket around it. She said watching you be gentle with her, reading to her, holding her hand at night, reminded her that some things can survive even when they've been broken. Seren didn't know what to say. She stood by the window, frozen, tears streaming silently down her face. Kale stood. He crossed the room slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted to. She didn't. He stopped an arm's length away. Close enough to touch, but not touching. I need to tell you something, he said. Okay. Auric Mallory is no longer a threat. The words hung in the air. Seren stared at him. What do you mean? 3 hours ago, federal agents executed a warrant at his home in Brennick Falls. They found evidence connecting him to the deaths of 4 women, evidence that had been buried for years, evidence that someone made sure they found. His voice was even, steady. He's been arrested. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison, if the charges stick. And they'll stick. I've made sure of it. Seren's knees buckled. Cale caught her. His hands gripped her arms, firm but not hard, steadying but not restraining, and he held her upright as the world tilted around her. It's over, he said. You're free. No one is looking for you. No one is tracking you. The alerts have been cleared. The reports have been rescinded. Your real name is clean. Seren couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She could only stand there, held up by a man she had known for less than a month, feeling something shift inside her that had been locked in place for so long she had forgotten it existed. Fear. The constant, low-grade hum of fear that had been the background noise of her life for 4 years. 3 with Auric, 14 months running from him. It was gone. Not fading. Not diminishing. Gone. I don't know how to feel, she whispered. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Cale looked at her. His hands were still on her arms. His face was still wet with tears for his mother. You don't have to do anything, he said. You don't have to feel anything you're not ready to feel. You just have to know that for the first time in years, you have a choice. A real choice. And whatever you decide, wherever you go, whatever life you build, you'll be building it because you want to, not because you're running. Seren looked up at him. This man who had terrified her a month ago. This man who ran an empire built on power and shadow. This man who had sat beside his dying mother and wept, who had mobilized an army to protect a stranger, who had kept a promise made by a 9-year-old boy to himself in a kitchen full of grief. I don't want to run anymore, she said. Then don't. I don't want to disappear again. You don't have to. I don't. Her voice broke. I don't know who I am if I'm not running. Cale's hand moved to her face. His thumb brushed a tear from her cheek. Then stay, he said quietly, and find out. The funeral was held 3 days later. It was small, only a handful of people, most of them faces Seren didn't recognize. But they came with flowers and silence, and the particular gravity of people who had loved Idine Morrigan and understood that her death marked the end of something that couldn't be replaced. Seren stood at the back of the chapel. She had offered to leave, to give the family privacy, but Cale had refused. She wanted you here, he said. She told me so. You stay. So she stayed. Afterward, the house fell quiet in a different way. The medical equipment was removed. The flowers on the nightstand were cleared. The curtains were drawn closed, then opened again, then drawn closed once more, as if the house itself couldn't decide whether to mourn in darkness or light. Seren remained. She wasn't sure why at first. Her job was finished. Idine was gone. The threat was eliminated. She had money. Cale had insisted on paying her triple her original rate, and she had been too exhausted to argue, and she had her freedom, real freedom, for the first time in years. She could go anywhere. She could become anyone. But she stayed. She told herself it was practical. She needed time to rest, to recover, to plan her next move. She told herself it was transitional, a few days, a week at most, and then she would find an apartment somewhere, start over, and build the life Idine had told her to build. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. She stayed because of Cale, not because he asked her to. He didn't. He gave her space, respected her boundaries, and treated her with a careful distance that she recognized as deliberate. He was trying not to pressure her, trying not to become another man who wanted something from her before she was ready to give it. But she noticed him. She noticed the way he moved through the house after his mother's death, slower, heavier, like a man walking underwater. She noticed that he stopped answering his phone in the evenings, letting it ring out while he sat in his mother's room and stared at the empty bed. She noticed that he kept the window cracked open, the way Adine had liked it, even though the November air was growing colder. And she noticed that he noticed her too. Not in the predatory way she had learned to recognize, the way Auric had watched her in the beginning, cataloging, calculating, and planning. Kale watched her the way someone watches a sunrise they don't want to miss. Quietly, completely, without expectation. 2 weeks after the funeral, Seren found him in the kitchen at midnight. He was sitting at the same wooden table where they had spoken that first morning, a cup of coffee in front of him, untouched and cold. He looked up when she entered, and something in his face shifted. Not a smile, but a softening. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Not lately." She poured herself a glass of water and sat across from him. "You?" "Not in years." The silence between them was different now. It had weight, but not pressure. It had texture, but not tension. It was the silence of two people who had seen each other at their most broken and chosen not to look away. "I keep waiting for it to feel real," Seren said quietly. "The safety, the not running. I keep waking up and expecting the fear to come back." "Does it?" "Sometimes. For a second, when I first open my eyes. And then I remember where I am. And I remember that he's gone. And the fear." She paused. "It doesn't disappear, but it gets quieter." Kale nodded slowly. "That's how it works. Not all at once. Gradually. Like ice melting." "How do you know?" He looked at his cold coffee, then back at her. "Because I've watched it happen before. Women I've helped. They don't transform overnight. They don't wake up one morning and suddenly feel whole. It takes time. Sometimes years. But it happens. If they let it." "And you?" Seren asked. "Have you ever let it happen to you?" The question surprised him. She could see it in the brief flicker behind his eyes, the slight pause before he answered. "No," he said. "I haven't." "Why not?" "Because I convinced myself that the calcification was necessary, that the hardness was what allowed me to help other people, that if I let myself soften, I would lose the only thing that made me useful." He met her gaze. "But lately, I've started to wonder if that was just another lie I told myself, a way to avoid dealing with what's underneath." Seren reached across the table. Her fingers brushed his knuckles, a touch so light it was barely there. "Your mother said something to me," she said. "The night before she died. She told me not to disappear, to let myself be found." Kale's hand turned slowly beneath hers. His palm opened, his fingers curled around hers. "And have you?" he asked. "Let yourself be found?" Seren looked at their hands, intertwined on the table. She looked at this man who had seen her at her most terrified and most raw. Who had mobilized armies for her without asking for anything in return. Who had wept for his mother and kept his promises, and looked at her like she was something worth waiting for. "I think I'm starting to," she said. 3 months later, on a February afternoon cold enough to turn breath into fog, Seren walked through the front door of a small house on the outskirts of Velden Ridge. It wasn't the estate. The estate had been too large, too heavy with memories. Instead, Kale had found this, a cottage by the sea with whitewashed walls and a garden that had gone wild with winter but would bloom again in spring. Seren had said she couldn't accept it, that it was too much, that she hadn't earned it. Kale had replied, "You're not accepting it, you're living in it. There's a difference." She had stopped arguing. The cottage had 3 rooms and a fireplace that crackled when the wind came off the water. It had a kitchen with a window that faced the sea and a bedroom with curtains that let in the morning light. On the nightstand sat a small vase of fresh flowers, the same kind Idine had loved, changed every few days by hands that Seren now recognized. She had a job at the hospital in town. Real work, under her real name, with colleagues who knew her story, or enough of it, and treated her like a person who had survived something difficult and come out standing. She had a phone with contacts saved. Not many, but enough. Corinth's number. Thorne's number. The number for a therapist she had started seeing twice a week. And she had Kale. Not in the way stories usually ended, not with grand declarations or dramatic confessions. It had happened slowly, the way Seren had learned to trust slowly. First, dinners at the cottage where they talked until midnight. Then walks along the shore where they didn't talk at all. Just moved through silence together. Then, one night, a kiss on the threshold of her door that tasted like salt air and something neither of them had known they were missing. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. For the first time in both their lives, they had time. On this February afternoon, Seren stood in her kitchen braiding her hair in the reflection of the window. The same braid, the same motion. The ritual that had carried her through years of terror and months of running and the slow, patient work of learning to stay. Behind her, the door opened. Kale stepped in, snow dusting the shoulders of his coat. "Something came for you," he said. He held out an envelope. Seren took it. The return address was a legal firm in the capital, Corinth's office. Inside was a single page. She read it once, twice, a third time. Then she set it on the table and pressed her hands flat against the wood. "It's done," she said. "The final charges." He took a plea. Life without parole. No possibility of appeal. Kale didn't say anything. He walked to her, stood behind her, and rested his hands on her shoulders. "It's really over," Seren whispered. "Yes." She turned. She looked up at this man, this complicated, calcified, quietly gentle man who had opened doors she hadn't known existed. "Idine was right," she said. "About what?" "About you. About me. About what becomes possible when someone refuses to look away." Kale's hand came up to her face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, where once there might have been bruises but now there was only warmth. "She usually was," he said. "Right, I mean." Seren smiled. A real smile, the kind that started at the mouth and traveled to the eyes and didn't stop until it reached somewhere deep inside the chest where trust lives, or where trust begins to rebuild. "I love you," she said. The words were not grand, they were not performed. They were pulled from a place that had been locked for so long that Seren had forgotten it existed. Kale didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, fully, completely, the way he had looked at her from the beginning, and in his eyes she saw the 9-year-old boy in the kitchen doorway, and the man who had built an empire on a promise, and someone else beneath both of them. Someone who had been waiting for permission to soften. "I love you too," he said. Outside, the February wind pressed against the cottage windows, carrying the salt smell of the sea and the distant cry of gulls. Inside, the fire crackled. The flowers on the nightstand held their color against the gray afternoon light. And somewhere in Velden Ridge, in a cemetery overlooking the water, Idine Morrigan's grave marker stood among the oak trees. Simple, elegant, engraved with the words she had chosen herself. She saw what others looked away from. Seren would visit that grave often in the years that followed. She would bring flowers, fresh ones, always fresh ones, and sit on the bench nearby and tell Idine about her week, her work, her life. She would tell her about the garden she was planting, about the dinners with Kale that lasted until midnight, about the nightmares that came less often now, and the mornings that came easier. And sometimes, when the wind blew a certain way, she would swear she heard something in the rustle of the oak leaves. Not words, exactly, but something close. Something that sounded like, "You're allowed to stay now. You're allowed to be found." And Saren would smile and wipe her eyes and walk back down the path toward the cottage where a man was waiting for her. A man who had kept a promise made in a kitchen 34 years ago. A man who had looked at a stranger in his mother's doorway and seen someone worth saving. The cottage door was always unlocked now, not because Seren had forgotten how to be afraid, but because she had finally learned that some doors are meant to stay open.